Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You can always feel it when a room is pretending everything's fine, that thick, sticky kind of politeness that clings to the walls like smoke after something's already burned, even though no one's willing to admit they smell it. That's exactly how the air felt in my mother's dining room that night, too quiet between bites, too forced between laughs, too many eyes darting my way, but never staying long enough to make it obvious. The roast chicken was perfect, the wine was flowing, and yet every word being spoken was carefully calculated to avoid the one topic hanging over the table like a chandelier about to drop: my promotion. It was there in the way my mother asked me about my drive to work, but not my office. It was there in how my cousin Leah kept glancing from me to Daniel like she was trying to gauge the temperature of the room before committing to a side. And of course, it was there most of all in Daniel's fake smile, that stretched, smug grin he wears when he's waiting for the perfect moment to unleash whatever half-baked insult he's been saving in his back pocket like a party trick. He was waiting, I could feel it. He always waited for the moment he could take the spotlight with one of his little jabs, the kind he pretends is just family teasing, but always lands with a sting sharp enough to make you clench your jaw just a little tighter. I didn't say much. I never do at first. I've learned over the years that when someone underestimates you, it's better to let them dig the hole deep enough on their own before you throw the dirt in. I passed the vegetables, sipped my wine, answered the small talk, and let the room simmer in its discomfort, because I knew, eventually, Daniel wouldn't be able to hold it in. And I was right. It happened somewhere between the second helping of mashed potatoes and the first mention of someone else's kid getting a promotion at a local bank. The conversation had drifted into career talk, as it always did, half bragging, half passive-aggressive comparisons, and I'd barely opened my mouth to say anything when Daniel leaned back in his chair, chuckled like a man warming up for a punchline, and said it. "Of course you got promoted," he said loud enough for every fork to pause midair. "You probably slept your way to the top." And just like that, the room shifted. For a second, it was dead quiet, not shocked quiet, but that weird, uncomfortable quiet where people wait to see how the target reacts before deciding whether to laugh or pretend they didn't hear. Then came the chuckles, low, awkward, half-hearted, the kind of laughter that doesn't come from actual humor but from the desperate need to ease the tension without confronting what caused it. My mother gave a tight-lipped smile, shook her head as if Daniel was just being playful, and Uncle Rob let out the kind of hollow laugh that sounds more like a cough than amusement. No one looked at me directly, just sideways glances and flickering eyes, like I might explode if stared at too long. But I didn't explode. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, and set my wine glass down as gently as if I were placing a chess piece. Because I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to defend myself. Because Richard, my boss, my mentor, my guest for the evening, was already shifting in his seat. He hadn't said much during the evening, choosing instead to observe the strange dynamics of my family like a man watching a car crash he'd accidentally been invited to. But now he cleared his throat, stood up, and smiled in a way that made Daniel's posture straighten just slightly, as if he'd suddenly realized the room had changed and he wasn't holding the cards anymore. "Actually," Richard said, his voice smooth, but carrying just enough weight to silence the murmurs, "Jessica didn't sleep her way to anything. She's taking my job next month. I'm retiring, and the board voted unanimously to promote her into my position." He paused there, letting the silence stretch, letting every word settle into the bones of the people around that table. "And frankly," he added, still smiling, "I've never worked with anyone more competent or deserving." That was the moment the laughter died. That was the moment Daniel's smirk evaporated and was replaced by something sour, something that looked a lot like fear. His face flushed red, his mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Across the table, my mother blinked twice and finally looked at me directly, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. I sat there, calm as ever, letting the silence work for me. Because there's something about being underestimated that becomes its own kind of power. When people expect nothing from you, every success becomes a detonation. Every truth becomes a blade. And sometimes you don't need to defend yourself, you just need to let them choke on their assumptions. And still, they didn't know everything. Because Richard's announcement wasn't even the biggest secret I'd brought to dinner. Have you ever had someone, especially a family member, try to dismiss your hard work with a cruel joke? Maybe even laugh while doing it? What did you say back, or what do you wish you'd said? Tell me, because I know I'm not the only one who sat quietly at a table, letting someone else make a fool of themselves while waiting for the perfect moment to drop the truth like a goddamn bomb. If you want to understand why some wounds take years to stop bleeding, you have to go all the way back to where the first cut was made, back to the early years when everything seemed harmless, but the damage was already taking root. For me, that place was a small 3-bedroom house with beige carpets, floral couch cushions, and the unshakable belief that boys were gifts and girls were supposed to be grateful just to be in the same room. From the time I was old enough to speak in full sentences, I learned 2 things. Daniel could do no wrong, and I should speak a little softer, sit a little stiller, smile a little more even when I didn't feel like it. Daniel was the golden child, the loud one, the one everyone bragged about at family dinners, even when he hadn't actually done anything worth bragging about. He could bring home a B- on a math test, and my mother would act like he'd solved a national crisis, ruffling his hair and saying, "Well, at least you're trying." Meanwhile, I could bring home a perfect score on a science project and she'd barely nod, sometimes not even looking up from her grocery list. I remember once getting the highest grade in my class on a history exam, not just a high grade, the highest, and all she said was, "Don't let it get to your head." No one likes a show-off. It was always like that. If Daniel forgot to do his chores, it was because he was a growing boy and needed rest. If I forgot, it was because I was getting lazy and needed to focus more on responsibilities. If Daniel shouted, he was being assertive. If I raised my voice even slightly, I was being bossy and difficult and needed to learn how to keep the peace. There's nothing more quietly infuriating than watching someone be praised for the same qualities you're punished for, especially when it happens so often it starts to shape the way you see yourself, not as the problem solver, not as the smart one, but as the problem, period. I think a lot of people assume that favoritism comes in big, obvious gestures, expensive gifts, special privileges, outright statements, but in my experience, it's death by 1,000 tiny dismissals. It's being told not to provoke him when he steals your toys. It's being scolded for sounding too proud when you answer a question correctly at dinner. It's being told he's just joking every time his jokes cut deeper than anyone realizes. And after enough years of those tiny cuts, you stop fighting back, not because you agree, but because you get tired of bleeding in front of people who keep pretending they don't see it. Daniel didn't become arrogant overnight. He was raised that way, shaped by years of being told he was the center of the universe, while I was gently pushed to the side to make room for his ego. And somewhere along the way, he started believing the lie that he was naturally superior, more valuable, more destined for success. The irony is, while he coasted on empty praise and low expectations, I was out there grinding, building, becoming the kind of woman he couldn't stand to be in the shadow of. Not because I was competing with him, I never needed to. I was competing with the version of myself that had once believed I wasn't enough. That's the part he couldn't handle. That's the part that made his jokes cut deeper, not because they were clever, but because they were desperate. Because somewhere deep down, I think Daniel knows what everyone else is starting to figure out, that I've become everything he was supposed to be. That I'm not the one chasing old trophies anymore. That I've quietly built a career, a life, a future that doesn't depend on anyone's validation, especially not his. And yet, my mother still won't see it. Or maybe she does and just refuses to acknowledge it, because doing so would mean confronting the fact that she bet on the wrong horse. Even now, she still says things like, "You know how Daniel is," whenever he says something crude or dismissive, as if it's my job to adjust my boundaries to accommodate his bad behavior. She still tells me not to make things worse when he lashes out, still tries to smooth things over when he makes jokes at my expense, like the only thing that matters is keeping the illusion of harmony intact, even if that harmony is built on my silence. I've spent years biting my tongue, swallowing my rage, letting him play the role of harmless older brother while I sat quietly in the corner being measured against a scale that was rigged from the start. But not anymore. Not this time. Not after what he said in front of our family, in front of my boss, in a room I earned my way into without anyone's help. That dinner wasn't just a gathering. It was a battlefield. And I'm not the one bleeding anymore. Success always looks effortless to the people who've never had to earn it the hard way, and I've lost count of how many times I've been told I got lucky or was in the right place at the right time. Like my career was the result of some cosmic accident instead of years of grinding myself down behind closed doors, working twice as hard just to be seen half as clearly. No one ever sees the late nights that bleed into early mornings, the hours spent rewriting presentations because a male colleague said my tone felt too aggressive, the meetings where my ideas were repackaged with a different voice and suddenly applauded. They don't see the parts of yourself you have to swallow just to survive in rooms that were never designed to hold your voice in the first place. I joined the company when I was 26, wide-eyed and driven, armed with degrees and ambition, but no map for how to navigate a workplace where competence mattered less than who you played golf with on weekends. From the beginning, it was clear that the rules weren't written for people like me. Promotions were passed around like favors at a poker table, handed to men who barely knew how to format a report but knew how to shake the right hands. I watched from the sidelines while coworkers with less experience and weaker results got bumped up the ladder simply because they reminded someone on the executive team of their son-in-law or old college roommate. And yet, I didn't leave. I stayed. I learned. I worked harder than I should have had to, took on every project no one else wanted, sat through endless hours of corporate small talk, and practiced my neutral smile until my face ached. I became the fixer, the go-to, the one they called when the ship was leaking and everyone else was too busy blaming each other to patch the holes. And slowly, painfully slowly, I started to earn their trust. But trust isn't the same as power, and I knew damn well that the real decisions were still happening in rooms I wasn't invited into. That's when Richard entered the picture. He wasn't flashy or charismatic or the kind of leader who gave motivational speeches and expected standing ovations. He was quiet, measured, and most importantly, he noticed things. He noticed how often my ideas were spoken over, how often credit for my work ended up in someone else's hands. He noticed that I stayed late without being asked, that I knew the difference between managing people and manipulating them. He never made a show of it, but every now and then, he'd stop by my desk and ask questions that told me he was paying attention in all the ways that mattered. Over time, that attention turned into mentorship, not the kind that's plastered on LinkedIn with buzzwords and photo ops, but real mentorship. The kind that happens in elevator rides and late-night emails and quiet words of encouragement when you're ready to walk out the door. Richard never once tried to rescue me, but he made sure I had the tools to fight smarter. He taught me how to navigate boardroom politics without losing my soul, how to choose battles that were worth bleeding for, and how to speak in a way that made people stop interrupting without raising my voice. Eventually, I started hearing whispers. Whispers that Richard was stepping down, whispers that a leadership shuffle was coming, whispers that the board was looking at internal candidates and I was on the shortlist. At first, I dismissed them. After everything I'd seen, I didn't dare hope. But Richard kept pulling me into higher-level strategy meetings, kept asking me to lead major initiatives, kept pushing me forward in subtle, strategic ways. And the whispers turned into conversations. Then those conversations turned into closed-door meetings. And then, one day, it was done. I was offered the position, not a temporary title, not a "we'll see how it goes" trial, but the full role. Executive leadership. Permanent. Everyone assumed Richard was just retiring because of age. That was the story HR circulated, the version that sounded clean and expected. But the truth is more complicated than that, and almost no one knows it, not even the people at that dinner table. Because what they don't know is that Richard's wife had been battling cancer for the last 2 years, quietly, privately, away from the prying eyes of gossip and office politics. There were days he didn't come into work, weeks when his attention drifted, months where he was just holding on. And during that time, I took over. Quietly. Completely. I ran that department from the shadows, made decisions in his name, protected his dignity while ensuring nothing collapsed under the weight of his absence. He trusted me not just with the business, but with the truth. And I honored that trust by keeping it quiet, by never once asking for recognition, by carrying the load so that no one else had to know what he was carrying at home. That's why he chose me, not because I'm ambitious, not because I'm capable, not even because I earned it, although I did. He chose me because he knows I lead the way he did, with integrity, with discretion, with the strength to do the work without needing applause every time I breathe. So yes, when Daniel sat at that dinner table and made his little joke about sleeping my way to the top, I smiled. I smiled because I knew something he didn't, something he'd never understand. That real power isn't loud, it isn't smug, it isn't delivered through cheap comments and second-hand pride. Real power is earned in silence, kept in trust, and revealed only when the moment calls for it. And still, even with everything they now knew, there was one final truth I hadn't spoken yet. One last move I'd been holding close, a personal secret that would shift everything they thought they understood about me, about what I'd built, about what I owned, about how far ahead I'd been playing this game all along. And when that moment came, even Richard's announcement would feel like a warm-up act. There's a particular kind of silence that hangs in the air after someone's pride has been publicly shredded, not the kind that invites healing or reflection, but the kind that tightens every breath and amplifies every fork scrape and wine sip like an awkward symphony of discomfort. That was the silence that followed Richard's announcement. Daniel's face was still red, and the way he shifted in his chair made it clear that whatever smug composure he'd walked in with had been ripped from him in front of the very audience he'd hoped to impress. But if there's one thing I've learned about men like my brother, it's that humiliation doesn't lead them to humility, it leads them to desperation. And desperation almost always pushes them to say something even dumber in a last-ditch effort to climb back on top of the pile they thought they owned. He cleared his throat too loudly, leaned back in his chair with a forced chuckle, and tried to act like the announcement hadn't gutted him from the inside out. "Well," he said, voice dripping with performative casualness, "guess I shouldn't be surprised. Jess always had a way of getting what she wants. Remember that guy she dated in college? What was his name? Nathan, right? The one with the internship hookup at the law firm? Yeah, she really knew how to play her cards." He smiled like he'd just delivered a witty callback, like we were all supposed to laugh and nod and pretend his implication wasn't as vile as it clearly was. My mother didn't flinch, which was almost more telling than if she had. Her silence had always been her weapon of choice, a passive kind of complicity that allowed Daniel's words to hang unchecked in the air like mold in the walls of a house no one wants to admit is crumbling. I didn't say a word. I didn't rise to it. I just picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip, and let the weight of his bitterness do the talking for me. Because sometimes you don't have to fight back. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do is give your enemy just enough rope to hang themselves with, and Daniel was practically fashioning a noose with every syllable. He kept going, like he couldn't stop himself, rattling off old stories that had nothing to do with anything. How I once got invited to a conference as an undergrad and stayed an extra night with some friend from the finance department. How I'd always had connections, how I knew how to work a room, all of it laced with that same toxic insinuation, that none of my achievements were really mine, that I had somehow charmed or flirted or manipulated my way through life while he, poor Daniel, had been overlooked by a cruel, unfair world that didn't reward his natural brilliance. Across the table, Leah was watching with wide eyes, not at me, but at Daniel. Her expression was shifting from amusement to confusion, then to something heavier, something more curious. You could see it on her face. She was starting to see the cracks in the family dynamic, starting to piece together what had really been happening all these years beneath the surface of Sunday dinners and holiday greetings. I saw her glance at our mother, who was still pretending not to notice that her son was tearing into her daughter with a smile on his face and a history of entitlement dripping from his tongue. That's when my phone buzzed silently beneath the table, a single vibration that I knew instantly came from Melanie. I slid it open discreetly and read the message without moving my face. "Do it. Drop the bombshell." You earned it. I almost laughed out loud, not because the timing was funny, but because she knew me so well it was scary. She knew I had something more, something bigger, something that would split the entire room in half like a lightning strike in dry grass. But I didn't move yet. I let the tension keep building, let Daniel's words pile higher, let his self-destruction reach the point of no return. Because I wanted them all to see it. Not just the anger. Not just the arrogance. I wanted them to see what it looked like when someone reveals their own irrelevance without even realizing they've done it. I wanted them to remember this dinner, every word, every pause, every shifting glance, because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about truth, about reclamation, about showing them that quiet doesn't mean weak, that stillness doesn't mean surrender, that the girl they once told to be less bossy had grown into a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to change the room. So I waited, calm and patient, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. I didn't reach for the final card yet, but I could feel it in my pocket like a heartbeat, pulsing with the truth I'd been holding all evening. Because Daniel wasn't done embarrassing himself yet, and I wasn't done watching him do it. And when the time came, when the final silence fell and everyone had nothing left to say, I'd be ready. Because this dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was a reckoning. There's a particular kind of stillness that falls over a room when the air shifts from petty jabs and shallow smugness into something heavier, something real, something that doesn't just bruise egos, but breaks the illusion entirely, and in that moment, as I looked across the table at Daniel, still clinging to whatever scraps of superiority he thought he had left, I knew it was time. I'd given him enough rope to hang himself 3 times over, and now all that was left was to speak the truth, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly, calmly, the way you say something so grounded in fact that no one dares to challenge it. So I set my fork down, wiped my hands gently on my napkin, and let the silence sit for another beat before I looked directly at him. Not at my mother, not at Leah, not at Richard, just him. The brother who had spent a lifetime treating my accomplishments like accidents, my intelligence like arrogance, and my career like a fluke. I could see it in his eyes, that flicker of anticipation that maybe I was going to fight, maybe I'd shout or snap back or try to defend myself. But instead, I smiled, small, deliberate, and unmistakably calm. You know, I said softly, you've spent this entire evening trying to reduce everything I've worked for down to a punchline. And I let you, not because you were right, but because I knew you needed to get it all out before the truth landed in your lap so hard it knocked the smug right out of you. That earned a few raised eyebrows, but I didn't stop there. I turned slightly, meeting the eyes of everyone at the table now, my mother, who looked like she was holding her breath, Leah, who looked riveted, and Richard, who was watching me with quiet approval, like a teacher watching his student step into her own power. You all heard Richard say I'm taking over his position, I continued, but what he didn't say is why he chose me. It wasn't just about performance reviews or office politics. It wasn't about timing or tenure or even merit in the way you'd expect. It was about something far more personal, something no one outside of our walls knew. Daniel's smirk was fading fast, and for the first time all evening, he looked genuinely unsure of what was coming next. For the last 2 years, I said, my voice steady but firm, Richard has been quietly caring for his wife, who's been battling cancer. He never wanted to step down early, never wanted anyone to treat him differently, and he never once asked for pity. But there were weeks when he couldn't come into the office. Months where he had to be by her side more than he could be at his desk. And through all of that, I was the one who kept the department running, not for praise, not for recognition, but because someone had to, and I wasn't going to let his years of work collapse under the weight of something he couldn't control. I paused there, letting the weight of that truth settle over the room like a heavy fog, letting the silence absorb every word before continuing. I didn't ask for a title. I didn't announce it in meetings or put it on a slide deck. I just did the work, quietly, efficiently, and without making it about me. Because sometimes leadership isn't about being seen. Sometimes it's about holding things together in the background while someone else keeps their dignity intact. The room was frozen. Even my mother, who had spent the better part of my life acting like Daniel was some sort of divine gift wrapped in mediocrity, was now staring at me with something that looked suspiciously like recognition or maybe guilt. And then, just when the silence felt thick enough to cut with a knife, I delivered the final blow, the one I'd been saving not out of spite, but because it was mine to reveal when I was damn well ready. Oh, and one more thing, I added, reaching into my bag and pulling out a simple envelope, no theatrics, no big reveal, just quiet certainty. I'm not just taking over Richard's role. I've been negotiating privately with the board, and I've finalized the paperwork. I'm buying into the company. Starting next quarter, I'll be a partial owner. The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was total recalibration. You could practically hear the sound of their mental gears grinding to catch up. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, like he couldn't decide whether to argue or apologize. My mother looked down at her plate like it might explain how the world had shifted without her permission. Leah's eyes went wide, then narrowed in admiration. And Richard? He just smiled, nodded once, and raised his glass. I told you she was ready, he said simply, before taking a slow sip. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to say anything else. The moment had already spoken louder than I ever could. Because when people spend their lives trying to define you by their limitations, the most powerful thing you can do is outgrow every box they tried to shove you into, and then burn the damn blueprint so no one else has to squeeze themselves into that same narrow space. I leaned back in my chair, folded my napkin, and let the quiet settle again. Not awkward now, not strained, just final. The kind of quiet that follows truth so undeniable it doesn't need to shout. And still, I wasn't quite finished. Not yet. Because this dinner wasn't just the end of something. It was the beginning of something else entirely. After the last wine glass had been rinsed and set on the drying rack, after the chairs were pushed in and the polite goodbyes exchanged with a tone far stiffer than they began, I stepped quietly out into the garden, meeting air that didn't taste like ego and old expectations. The sky was deep navy now, the kind of soft darkness that hums with a stillness only night can offer, and the garden lights flickered gently over the gravel path I'd helped my mother install years ago, back when I still believed that helping build something together might one day mean being seen for more than what I wasn't. There's something about being outside in the quiet, away from the heat of voices and the clatter of cutlery, that strips you down to your truest thoughts. I stood there under the archway of ivy, arms crossed, letting the crisp air settle against my skin, and I thought about how long it had taken me to arrive at this moment, not just physically standing in my mother's garden, but metaphorically standing in the space where I no longer needed anyone's approval to feel whole. For years, I'd carried the weight of silence, of being passed over, of watching my efforts praised only when someone else put their name on them, and somewhere along the way, I'd stopped trying to win a game that was never designed for me to win in the first place. It wasn't about the promotion. It wasn't even about the ownership or the title. It was about the quiet war I had fought my entire life, the kind that doesn't leave bruises or make headlines, but chips away at your sense of self every time you're told to be less so someone else can be more. I remembered a moment from years ago, I must have been 11, maybe 12, when I had spent hours building a model for the school science fair. I'd crafted it from scratch, measured every angle, painted every surface, memorized every detail of the process. But during the dinner that followed, when our parents were proudly retelling the story, it was Daniel who got the praise for helping me out, even though he hadn't so much as picked up a brush. I'd protested, just a little, just enough to make my discomfort known, and I remembered my mother's words so clearly it still echoed sometimes. Don't make a scene, Jessica. Let your brother have this. As if my silence was a gift I was expected to keep giving, as if my hard work was something that could be sacrificed to avoid ruffling the delicate feathers of his self-esteem. That was the moment something in me had started to fracture, not in a way that broke me entirely, but in a way that forced me to begin building a new version of myself from pieces no one else knew how to value. And tonight, in that dining room filled with legacy-fueled arrogance and half-cloaked resentment, I hadn't made a scene. I'd made a statement. I hadn't raised my voice. I'd raised the bar. Because sometimes the loudest declaration isn't a scream, it's the silence that follows a truth so undeniable that even your worst critics can't find a single word to throw back at you. Behind me, I heard the soft crunch of gravel and turned to find Leah approaching, hands in her coat pockets, expression soft but thoughtful in the low light. She didn't say much, she never did, but I saw something in her eyes that told me she'd watched every moment of that dinner more closely than anyone realized. "I think they finally saw you," she said gently, not as a compliment, but as a confirmation, like someone closing a chapter and handing you the book. I looked back toward the house, the light in the dining room now dimmed, shadows moving behind the curtains, and I nodded once, not in triumph, but in something quieter, something closer to peace. Because this was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I never needed their permission to be right in the first place. Funny thing about respect, sometimes you don't wait for it. Sometimes you build it so loud they can't ignore it, and then you let it speak for you.